AITA for telling my dad his grief doesn't get to dictate the name my wife and I chose for our children. My dad and I 28M have a complicated relationship. He was divorced from my mom when I was only a baby and she died when I was very young, 5. He was already remarried and had another child when my mom passed away. And I think he expected with time that I would forget about my mom entirely and assimilate into his new family like they were the only one. There was also a big effort to ignore my grief and to expect me to move on like nothing happened. The only time this was ever truly mentioned was when I was 13 and he sat me down and asked me to ask his wife if she'd adopt me. He told me she wanted to adopt me but didn't want me to get angry at her for asking. Because I still had a photo of my mom in my bedroom and I talked about her still. During that little talk, he made a point of saying his wife had raised me far longer and had done everything a real mother should. So it was time for me to acknowledge her in that role and position in my life and make it official. When I said no, he threw a little tantrum, stomping his foot and pouting before he left the room, and he never mentioned it again. But that strain could be felt. His wife died 3.5 years ago. I was engaged to my wife at the time and we were planning our wedding. 6 months after her death, Dad asked how I could move forward with the wedding planning. I told him I still wanted to get married. He said he couldn't understand it and he thought the wedding would be delayed for years. I told him that wasn't happening. He never said anything about it again, but I now know he held it all in. And now it has come to the surface again. My wife is pregnant with our first child, our daughter, and we have agreed to name her after my mom. My wife wanted a nature name, and my mom had a nature name, so it worked perfectly for us. We haven't announced this yet. During a family dinner with my side, one of my siblings asked if we had a name yet. I said maybe. We weren't saying for sure until she was here. My dad said we all know the baby will be named after his late wife, and there's no point in hiding it. I told him he didn't know that at all. He lost his temper and told me if I had any respect for our family, that is exactly what I'd do. He told me he's grieving, my siblings are grieving, and I should take that into consideration. I told him that has nothing to do with what we name our child. He wanted to talk one-to-one, and I agreed to do so. He told me if I'm hiding the name like that, then I must be naming my daughter after someone else. Likely that woman, and how I was inconsiderate to consider such a thing. When his wife had raised me, and his wife had died in the last for years. He told me a good son would take this into consideration and honor the woman his father loved, the woman who raised him as her very own. I told him his grief does not get to dictate the name my wife, and I choose for our child. I told him my grief didn't seem to matter when I was 5, so why was I supposed to put his adult grief first now? I told him there was going to be no more talking about baby names because it was none of his business. He has since accused me of invalidating his grief and being insensitive to it. AITA.